My son and I have roasted over 50 kilos of a Papua New Guinea coffee on this 500 gram drum roaster. It's absolutely delicious. We've really enjoyed drinking this coffee, and now we want to take this profile and apply it to a different coffee roaster. We want to get the same result, and I'm going to show you how I do that today, roasting it on the Fresh Roast SR540. So stick around. All right, this is a carry-on in a series that I've been doing with this Papua New Guinea coffee. My intention is to roast this coffee on different types of home coffee roasters. A few weeks ago we roasted on the Hive. Today we're roasting on the Fresh Roast SR540, and I'm aiming for a flavor profile that tastes very similar to what we've achieved here on my drum roaster. And I'm going to show you how I did that here today. I did a roast. I've actually done quite a few roasts to try to figure this out. The air roaster, a Fresh Roast SR540, is very different. It roasts very different than a drum roaster. And so there has to be some changes. We have to make some tweaks. I want to make sure that I have the same color result of my beans. I want to be sure that when I roast the coffee, that the same color, which should indicate a very similar temperature, will be the end result. That is one element that's going to help me get to the same result. If I have a darker bean or a lighter bean, there's a good chance that the roast level is going to be different. Now, why don't I just use the exact same temperatures? That might be a question you're asking in your mind. I asked that question myself, and the answer is that we're using different types of probes, different types of probe placement. We're using them in a different way, and so the information is going to be different. And so all we can do is use the probes as a reference for the fresh roast roaster as we're roasting coffee. And when we go from coffee to coffee or from roast to roast, we can compare temperatures with my same exact roaster in this environment. You may have a fresh roast and you may be using probes, but the temperature readings are probably going to be different, and so we can't necessarily rely on temperatures to go from one roaster to the next. All right, so bean color is really important, and we're going to be talking about bean color at the end of the roast as well. The other factor that I'm trying to find is some sort of a waypoint, a consistent piece of data that I can transfer from the drum to the fresh roast is my time in the browning or the Maillard phase. That's this middle phase. So from dry end until first crack, that total amount of time that's there. The development phase is 1 minute and 46 seconds. And so I want the roast to be very similar from what I was doing on the drum to what I was doing here on this air roaster. So the time from dry end to first crack is really important, and that's one target or one time period that you can have. And the same thing with development till you drop the coffee. So what happens with the dry phase? Now, I did a video why the dry phase is so important, and I really believe, and I still believe, it's probably the most important part of your roast, especially for a drum roaster or somebody that's not using an air roaster. But even with an air roaster, it's really important because this time helps set you up for success for the rest of the roast. The things that I shared in that video are really helpful. I'll have a link to it as well. I'll have a card that shows up in the corner, and I'll also have a link to that in the description. That's really helpful. But I want to be sure that during the dry phase that I'm calling dry at the same color that I would on that roaster. I can't rely on temperatures. I have people ask me all the time, what temperature is your dry time temperature? What temperature is your first crack temperature? Well, on this roaster, it's 330 degrees-ish, and it give or take 10 degrees, depending upon how much coffee I'm roasting, the type of coffee, and so on. My first crack is 386 degrees. On this machine, in this roaster, it's going to be different. So I can't necessarily rely on the exact same temperatures as I had mentioned earlier. All right, so we have the color of the beans that we talked about. We talked about the event times in the phases from dry end to first crack and from first crack till drop. Those two event times are going to match what we did on the drum roaster. I'm using probes so you can see my temperatures. I'm using Artisan. We're going to talk about the roast profile as we go through this, and ultimately you're going to see what the result is. So let's get this set up and talk about what we're doing here. First, we're using an SR540 that is modified. It's using an extension tube as well as the extension for the chaff collector. I got that for a Christmas gift, the chaff collector extension. I've been using it. I've really enjoyed it because it does let a little more air breathe out of the roaster, but the top still gets hot. You know, there's some things about the fresh roast that I just need to prepare for, and I made a mistake even in this roast here today that ultimately affected the flavor of the coffee a little bit. But once you get to know your roaster, it's important to be prepared. And I'm telling you that even though I didn't necessarily do that completely. And we'll get to that towards the end here. All right, the other thing is I'm using Artisan. I'm using a probe setup here that I know is different than a lot of people might use for their fresh roasts or their devices. And I'm using this because I learned this from the Ikawa system, the way that the Ikawa probes are set up. So I am using my exhaust temperature. That's going to be the red line on the screen. And that probe is going to be reading the hottest air that is coming into the roaster. I'll use the term inlet temperature because that's what Ikawa uses. I'm using that inlet temperature to show me how much energy I have that I can use to roast my coffee. And I do the same thing with my drum roaster. My exhaust temperature is my indicator for how much energy I have in my roaster. It's really helpful for me, and I've been able to roast some great coffee relying on that information. So I'm doing the same thing here, and so that probe is going to go all the way down through the bottom of the roasting chamber into the actual roasting base. So here's the bottom of the fresh roast, and this probe is going to go right up against one of these holes right here. It may even go into the hole a little bit, but it's going to be as close to this screen as possible, and that is going to let me know how much energy that I have that's coming into the roaster. The other line that I'm using is the bean temperature. I don't necessarily want the bean probe to be down into the bean mass because it's really close to that inlet temperature, and I don't want to just be reading hot air. So like Ikawa does, they've got the probe just above the bean mass, and that gives me a reading. And I guess the bottom line is that the probes aren't moving, so the temperature readings are consistent, and so I just use that data to be able to help me understand what's happening with my roast while I'm roasting using Artisan. All right, so let's get into the roast, and we'll get started here. I'm roasting 170 grams of Papua New Guinea coffee. Here it is. This coffee is a pretty hard, pretty dense coffee. It's not a super high density coffee. I would call it a high density coffee, but not super high density coffee. It can handle the heat, and that's why I felt comfortable with this 4-minute dry time. You'll see me do the probe placement here where the first probe is the long one. That goes all the way to the bottom. And then the second probe you'll see just a little ways into the top, and we're ready to get started here on the roast. I'm going to be using full fan to start and a power setting, the lowest power setting possible on this roaster. What's really interesting is that even on the lowest power setting on the Fresh Roast SR540, we're going to see temperatures climb really, really quick here. And so here we go. We're getting ready to charge the roaster. Power's on, charge, and right away I'm going to go ahead and mark the temperature and the fan. So there is my lowest temperature of 1. It says 10 on here, F10, but it's 1. And then F9 on the fan. Look at that red line climb quickly. That is my inlet temperature. That is the heat coming out of the bottom of the roaster. It's very hot. It's already 300 degrees. It's crazy hot, and it's only 30 seconds into the roast. My rate of rise skyrocketed, and right now my rate of rise is 100 and let's see, my rate of rise is 113. Now it's starting to come down. 113 degrees a minute climbing rate, and it's surprising how powerful this is. All right, you'll see here that my inlet temperature is starting to wane. It's starting to bend. So I'm making a power adjustment to 2 now because I want that inlet temperature to continue to climb. My goal is to have that inlet temperature up to about 450 degrees or a little higher than that. So I'm going to be making power adjustments along the way. I'm going to also be making some fan adjustments along the way. You'll see right now that my fan is still at full power, but once the beans start to loft like they are right now, I'm going to start to slow my fan down. So I've made 3 power adjustments. I am now at a 3, and I'm lowering my fan down to 8. And I'll do that here in just a second. I don't want the beans to go way up near the chaff collector and get sucked up into the chaff collector. And so I want to keep the beans probably about halfway or just a tiny bit more than halfway. And then I'll start to modify the fan to keep that down. By modifying the fan, by lowering the fan speed, I'm raising temperatures, and you'll see that result as well. All right, we're 2.5 minutes into the roast, and now you're seeing my rate of rise come down to a visible area where you're going to be able to watch the behavior of my rate of rise. Now, for me, I don't care about my rate of rise and how it behaves during the dry phase. It really isn't going to influence the coffee. Really, I want to have a descending rate of rise during the rest of the roast, during the other 2 phases, and I want it to be fairly consistent. It's extremely difficult to do that here with the fresh roast. It's not easy to do with any roaster, at least the ones that I've been using, unless it's an automated roaster. But here you're going to see I haven't hit dry yet, and my rate of rise is it went from descending, now it's climbing. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that until we get into this next phase, and then I'm going to want it to settle in. And it's going to take a little bit of time for it to settle in, but you'll see exactly what happens here in just a second. So we are now down to a 5 on our heat and a 6 on the fan. We're getting this coffee really hot and ramped up, and looking at the color, it looks yellow, but in close, there's still a little green in there, and so I call my dry end when I don't see any green left. And we are just about there, and then you'll see me mark dry end. Power has now gone up to 7, and there's dry end at 4 minutes and 2 seconds. All right, so now we have a target time that we want to reach, which is about 7 minutes for first crack. So how do I determine how I'm going to get to first crack at 7 minutes? Number 1, practice. Number 2, familiarity with the bean color. And 3, know the pace of your roast. And you can get a pretty good approximate of range of when that's going to happen within maybe 20-25 seconds. And then also become familiar with your temperatures and when you would normally see first crack. So now we have it dry. We have this rate of rise that peaked again and is now starting to descend. My goal is to have a fairly consistent descending rate of rise for the rest of the roast. Over time, if we were not to make any power adjustments, at some point the exhaust temperature is going to level out and the bean temperature is going to bring itself closer and closer and closer, but it's going to be at a slower rate. Well, that's the same thing that's happening with the rate of rise. It's going down and down, and it's at a lower rate. The closer we will get to the bottom, the slower the bean temperature is rising. And so we see a flick happen right here. I'm not making any adjustments to the heat because it's already too late for me to respond and do that, but that's okay. That flick lasted all of about 15, 20 seconds, and it wasn't that significant, so I'm okay with that. All right, so we are working our way down to this 7-minute target, and you can see the bean color. I'm watching the bean color, and it's definitely gone from the yellowish to a brownish to now a darker brown, where I know that I am getting close to first crack. I can also smell the coffee, and I can smell some of the sweetness and that baked goods kind of a smell that I would get in the roast, and I know that I'm headed towards first crack. My rate of rise right now is about 15, and I'm fine with that. That is exactly where I want to be as I'm approaching first crack. If it's a lot higher than that, then I'm going to fly through too quickly through my roast and especially my development time, and I'm going to end up with a coffee that's darker than I want it to be. So that's why it's important to control your rate of rise, and that's what I'm trying to do here. All right, we are at first crack. I marked it. It was at 6 minutes and 52 seconds. So that's about 8 seconds earlier than I wanted for my first crack, but I'm happy with the result. And now you can hear first crack taking place. That's good. It's audible. That's one of the things I like about the fresh roast. I can still hear first crack. I can see the beans. I love the fresh roast as far as visibility goes and being able to really see and hear what's going on with the fresh roast. Even with the motor, I can still hear first crack. Some coffees are quiet, and then you'd have difficulty hearing first crack roasting. All right, the cracking now is going to start to subside, and now it's all about development. Look at my rate of rise. It's still slowly going down, and I have not adjusted my heat here for a couple of minutes. I'm just letting this play out naturally, as I talked about, where we have these two lines getting closer together as far as roasting goes. It's not necessarily visible seeing that here, but the bean temperature has continued to rise while my exhaust temperature has been fairly flat during this period of time. So really, really interesting. All right, so here's my mistake. It's time to pull this stuff out of the roaster. I'm hitting drop now, and I'm hitting cool. Well, I'm hitting cool now. Cool's already started. But I haven't hit drop yet because I want my temperatures to, the coffee's still roasting. I want my temperatures to drop a little bit, and then I mark drop like I did just now. All right, let's take a little closer look at the roast profile that we ended up with here. We had a total roast time of 8 minutes and 38 seconds. Dry time was 4 minutes and 8 seconds. 48% of the total roast time was devoted to drying the beans. 32%, or 2 minutes and 44 seconds, was devoted towards this middle phase, the browning phase. And then 1 minute and 46 seconds, 20.5% of the roast is development. Rate of rise, we had a couple little humps happen there, but overall, very happy with the way that the rate of rise went with the fresh roast. Very difficult. And again, you guys take a look. You'll notice that after that last temperature change that I made with the heat and the fan, that set me up for the rest of my roast. So that happened around 5 minutes. And so at 8 minutes and 38 seconds, I had not touched the fan or the heat for the rest of the roast. That is pretty interesting, and you can see on the graph the result of that. So really the question is, what could I have done differently? Well, first, I didn't have my gloves with me, so I couldn't just grab that lid and pull it off and dump the coffee into my cooling tray. That's what I would normally have done. I didn't prepare like I should have. So that was a mistake. So the coffee stayed in a little bit longer during the cool, and it probably got a little more development added to it than I wanted. But it comes down to the taste. and we're going to go ahead and do that now. I roasted this coffee several days ago, filmed it, and now I narrated it for you, but I've been enjoying drinking this for the last few days, and it's been a really good coffee. Is it the same as what we've been doing on the drum roaster? Yes, it's pretty much the same coffee. So here it is. And it's got all of the same notes. It's got the PNG rustic jungle hempy kind of a note going on there. There is a milk chocolate that just kind of sinks into your tongue. It's really delicious. There is a sweetness that is in this coffee that just kind of goes on and on. It's not a bitter coffee at all. And that's one of the things I love about the way that I roast, is that I don't take the coffee too far into the roast where I start to lose that sweetness and then start to basically roast out the origin. I want a little bit of that origin note in there. I want some sweetness in there when I can get that from the coffee. And I don't want to go too dark. So for me, I'm looking at a medium roast coffee. This is what I would consider a full medium, or maybe just a little bit less than that. Temperature-wise, you can see the picture here of the beans. It is, the beans aren't shiny. The beans aren't totally smooth. And so for me, it's kind of a medium to maybe a little lighter than a full medium roast. And I judge that based on the smoothness of the bean. The weight percentage loss was 14.8. So I think that if I would have pulled the coffee out a little earlier, we would have been about 14.2, 14.3. And that is right in spec of what we were doing here on this machine with the drum roaster. So great coffee, really enjoyed it. And my question to you is, have you done this? Have you taken a profile from a drum roaster, and have you used the time in the development and the time in the browning phase to translate into your roaster? I'd be interested in hearing what you did to try to achieve the same flavor profile. If you've done something completely different and ended up with a similar result, I'd love to hear that as well. We didn't really have roasting defects, so I was really happy with that 4-minute dry time. That is something that I did not want to have, was coffee that was either unevenly roasted or coffee that had some sort of roasting defect in it, like tipping or something like that with the air roaster. So I'm happy with that. So share your thoughts on what you saw here in this video. The next roaster we're going to be hitting, I'm thinking maybe the popper. I haven't used that in quite a while, so we'll pull that out and we'll try to do something very similar with that roaster. I have a feeling that it's going to be a little different, so we're looking forward to that. I've got some other exciting videos planned for the future, so if you haven't subscribed, be sure to subscribe to my channel. You guys, if you like this content, please hit the thumbs up now. That is awesome. I really appreciate that. And thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you guys have a great day and have a great week roasting. We'll see you next time.